Guys, I have literally just had to take myself on a walk because I was so excited to film this video that when I went to record it a couple of hours ago, I became incapable of speaking actual words. Everything pretty much just sounded like because I was trying to get it all out so fast that I've literally just had to take myself on a walk to calm myself down. But I'm back and I believe I'm calm. I feel calm and I'm ready. I hope you guys are ready. Oh, what if you're not ready? Oh my god. Right guys, I hope you're sitting comfortably, and definitely you're going to need a pair of ears that are going to get chewed off, because today I am recommending the crap out of Jane Eyre. I have loved Jane Eyre from the moment I found out about it, and when I say I'm going to recommend the crap out of this film, what I mean by that is I'm probably going to just tell you everything that happens. However, once you've listened to me tell the story of Jane Eyre, you're probably going to want to go and watch it anyway, because, you know, I do that to people. They go away and they watch it, and then they come back to me and they tell me that I severely hyped it up, because that's been known to happen on a few occasions. However, what I will say on that is, guys, it's all about interpretation, isn't it? You know? Do you know what I mean, Jellybean? And just draw your own conclusions on life, because that's what you do, right? So, and all I'm doing is telling you mine. Isn't she beautiful? Look at that. Oh guys, let me tell you something. If you have never read Jane Eyre or watched it, I am so excited for you, because you are in for a treat. Okay, so first things first. It's a period drama, which everyone probably knows. Everyone's probably heard of Jane Eyre, even if you haven't watched it or read it. It's just a very well-known story. The Brontes are very well-known authors, and for me, Charlotte Bronte is my favourite Bronte writer. No disrespect to the others, I do like the others, but she for me just hits the nail on the head. She's absolutely fantastic. I'm talking Gary Barlow, absolutely fantastic. She's just a brilliant storyteller. The words she uses, oh my god, wait till I hit you with some of these words. You're gonna be out for the count, mate. Out for the count. And the reason I want to recommend you watch Jane Eyre is because there's a lot of people my age that don't necessarily get drawn to things like this, to period dramas. They think that, you know, it's not relevant to them, it's in Victorian eras, they can't relate to it, you know, it's really boring, it's really long, they won't be able to necessarily understand the language or anything like that. But guys, who can't relate to love? That's what this is all about. It's about love, man. It's just about love, okay? It's about a girl who wants to be loved. Okay, there's more to it than that, but you know, essentially it's just about love. Who can't relate to that? If you do watch the film that I'm going to recommend to you, I'm going to recommend which adaptation you should watch first. But after, if you are really interested in it, there is more in the book, so if you read the book, nothing will get spoiled for you. Because this story is obviously a Bronte story, it's been out for years. Like, this story is older than me and your grandma combined. Like, it's a very old story, so you can imagine the amount of adaptations this story has put out over the years. There are loads. There are not only films, there are loads of mini-series. So the film I want to recommend to you is the 2011 adaptation of Jane Eyre, which has got Michael Fassbender in. It's got Mia Wasikowska in it. God, I hope I'm saying that right. And it's got Dame Judi Dench in it. That is the one that I want to recommend to you all. I know there's going to be loads of people out there, they're going to be like, that's not the best one, you're recommending the worst one. Like I said, mate, it's my video. I'm recommending this one. I'm joking. The reason I'm recommending this one is because I believe that this particular movie captures all the important, intense encounters between Jane Eyre and Mr. Rochester. And the actors, Michael Fassbender and Mia, their chemistry is amazing, their acting's spot on, and come on guys, let's face it, he is the best Mr. Rochester we've seen. Don't lie. Don't lie, okay? So that is the one I'm going to be talking about. Let's get into it. So guys, the beginning of this story is the end of the story. It's the beginning of the end. And we see Jane Eyre running. She is running for her life. And she's crying and she's really upset. It's a really dark and cloudy day. And she runs for such a long time. She gets so tired. She just collapses. She's got no energy left. She's just tired, hungry, wet, cold, and losing her mind a little bit. And in the distance, she sees a light, and she looks a bit closer and she can recognise the silhouette. It's a house. So she tries to go and seek refuge at this house, but she's so weak she can barely make it to the door. So she's dragging herself to this door. She manages to get to the front door, tries to knock on the door, but it's a really rainy day, it's really loud. This man sees her. He's like walking around the corner and he sees her, picks her up, and he takes her inside. And you go inside, it's lovely and it's warm and the fire's going, and he puts her in this chair. And then these two girls come running out, and they're sisters, and they're like, "Who's this, St. John? Who have you brought?" And he's like, "I don't know, I found her on the doorstep, ask her name." And then she gives a fake name. And that, my friend, is how the movie starts. What an introduction. So as the days go on, they've taken her in and she's kind of recuperating, getting better again. And while she's lying in bed, she starts to reflect on her life. And that is when we go right back to the start. Jane Eyre is about, basically, it's about this girl called Jane, obviously. And her parents have died. She's a little girl, her parents have died, and her uncle, her mother's brother, has taken her in. However, her uncle gets sick and her uncle dies, leaving her in the care of her aunt and her two cousins, who are all horrifically horrible. And the aunt really hates Jane for some reason, even though Jane is not a bad kid. She's just really quiet, she reads all the time, she tries to keep herself to herself. But her cousin, John, absolutely hates her and bullies her and terrorizes her, and they fight so much that she has to really defend herself. And in defending herself, she draws a bit of his blood. And the mother comes running in, her aunt comes running in, thinks that she's a nuisance, that she's horrific. And the boy, John, he obviously starts carrying and acting like she attacked him, when we all know that she didn't. And anyway, the aunt doesn't want to deal with her, doesn't want to cope with her. She is somebody else's child, and so she enrolls her in a school. It's an all-girls school, and she never allows her back for any breaks or Christmases. So basically, Jane goes to this school as a little girl, and she does not come out until she is an adult. She does not leave that school. So they literally teach her, and all she has is her education. So she grows up to be a very smart, intelligent woman. Cuts to, she's grown up and she's obviously spent a lot of time at this school, and she's ready to leave. And the reason she leaves the school is because she has got a job. So Jane has managed to get herself a job as a governess at this manor called Thornfield, and she thinks that the lady of the household is Mrs. Fairfax, and that she'll be tutoring Mrs. Fairfax's daughter, Adele. However, she travels to Thornfield. It takes a very long time. She takes a horse and carriage. She arrives in the middle of the night to Thornfield, and when she enters the, I would say house, but let's face it, it's not. It's like a bloody castle, or mansion. It's massive. Thornfield Manor is massive. And she enters it, and Dame Judi Dench is Mrs. Fairfax, or Miss Fairfax, should I say. And she meets Jane Eyre, and she takes off her bonnet, and she's like, "Oh, you're really young." And then Jane Eyre's like, "Oh, I'm very qualified, I assure you." So Judi Dench, Miss Fairfax, takes Jane around the manor, tries to find her room, and she's talking, Miss Fairfax says about the house, about Mr. Rochester, and then Jane Eyre's like, who's Mr. Rochester? I thought you were the lady of the manor. And Miss Fairfax is like, well, who, me? No, I'm just the housekeeper. Mr. Rochester's the owner of Thornfield, and Adele is a little girl that he brought back to England from France. So Mr. Rochester had like a thing with Adele's mother, and then something happened to the mother and he took the child and brought her back to France. Sorry, brought her back to England, to Thornfield. And so she obviously needs a governess because she can't speak a word of English, so she can't go to school. So they obviously had to hire a governess who could speak French, and Jane, she can do anything. So they hired Jane because she can speak French. So now Jane's got in her head like, oh my god, it's a man that owns this house, and she's very obviously inexperienced with speaking to men because she's not had to. Anyway, Miss Fairfax just informs Jane Eyre that don't worry, because he's not really here most of the time, he's always away on his travels, and if he does come back then we are made aware of it a very long time in advance so we can get the house ready and stuff. But Miss Fairfax, she keeps the house in order anyway. Stay ready so I don't have to get ready. So a couple of weeks go by, Jane Eyre has settled in, and everything's going really well. She's getting along really well with Adele, she's getting along really well with Miss Fairfax, but they're not of her age. One is really young, one is really old, not much conversation goes on, and she gets a bit bored, I would say. And Miss Fairfax can see that in her eyes, and so one day she says to her, why don't you go for a walk, and whilst you're there go and post some of these letters for me. Jane's like, alright then, yeah, I'll go and get some fresh air. So she puts a bonnet on and off she goes to the post office. Was it called the post office back then? Oh, I don't know. She goes to go and post her letters, and on her way there she has her first encounter with somebody. And I'd say first encounter, but really it's a bit of a big hoo-ha. So she gets frightened because it's the woods and it's really dark, it's miserable weather, it always is. And she hears a horse, so she gets scared, and the horse gets scared, and so the person on the horse gets thrown off the horse, and then we realise that it's this man. And he's like, who the hell are you? What you doing walking in the middle of the woods? She's like, I'm a governess at Thornfield. Not quite like that, but that's what she says. And she goes, I want to help, are you okay? And he goes, well, bring my horse to me. He's in a foul mood, I just got to let you know. And she tries to go and get the reins off of the horse, but the horse kind of acts out, and then he looks at her and he's like, it'll be easier if you bring me to the horse. But that means, guys, that she would have to touch him, and you know, she's not about that life at the moment, and so she kind of hesitates a bit, and he looks at her and he's like, please, Miss Governess, if you could bring me to my horse, that'd be great. And she's like, okay. So she goes and he puts his arm around her, and he's sprained his ankle because he's obviously been thrown off the horse, and he gets back on top of the horse and he goes, you better make haste with your letters, who knows what might be lurking in these woods, and then just troddles off and leaves her to it. And she's probably thinking, what an idiot, and then goes about her day. When she gets back from posting her letters, or Miss Fairfax letters, Miss Fairfax runs to the door and she's like, oh my god, child, where have you been? Don't you know Mr. Rochester's back? And she's like, what? No. Obviously putting two and two together, thinking, oh my god, that guy must have been Mr. Rochester, and I've just made the worst first impression in the world. And Miss Fairfax says, oh my god, he's in a foul mood, he came off his horse, and starts saying all this, and then in the back of Jane's mind she's thinking, oh my god, it is him. And then Miss Fairfax says, he wishes to see you, put on a new dress. And then she's like, well, all my dresses look like this. And she's like, I don't care, go and pick out a new one and go and see to him in the tea room, because that's where he's waiting for you, kid. She's like, oh my god. So she goes and changes, and she comes back down, and he's just sat there in the chair with his leg up, just waiting for her. And he looks at her, and Adele's in the room, and Miss Fairfax comes into the room, and Miss Fairfax starts talking Jane up, like bigging her up, saying oh how well she's been doing, and starts going on with herself basically. And then Mr. Rochester puts an end to it and he says, don't trouble yourself to give her a character. I could do that very well myself, thank you. And while she wasn't there, Adele gave Mr. Rochester Jane Eyre's scrapbook, because she loves to draw. So when she's walking in, he's sat there looking through her art. I know, he doesn't even know her like that yet. But he's sat there just looking through her art, and he's quite amazed actually that she has done this. And he says, where did you get your pictures from? And she's like, my head. And he looks at her and he's like, that very head I see on your shoulders. And she's just like, yeah. He wants to know a bit about her, where she comes from. She explains about Mrs. Reed of Gateshead, her aunt who cast her out. She explains where she went to school, and then straight from school she came here, and that's it. And he's like really intrigued by her, and then he says, so you were cast out, you have no tale of woe. Don't ask me what that means because I don't know. And then he dismisses her after he sees her paintings and just says good night, meaning do one basically. She's like, okay. And so she can't really suss him out at this stage. She's like, that was a bit weird. So a couple of days go by and it's night time again. Everybody has come into the living room where the fire is, and Mr. Rochester has brought Adele a present from wherever he went, and it's a dress. So she goes to try it on, and Miss Fairfax, Judi Dench, goes with her. So this is the first time, guys, that Jane Eyre and Mr. Rochester are alone in the room. And he takes a sip of a drink, right? He takes a sip of a drink and she's watching him, and he goes, your gaze is very direct, Miss Eyre. Do you find me handsome? And she's like, no. No, but we all know that she's probably thinking a little bit. And he goes, well, what faults do you see in me? I have all my limbs and features. And then she comes out with, I'm sorry, sir, I was meant to say beauty is of little consequence. And he's a bit taken back by these answers. He doesn't think to himself that a girl of her age, and there is a big age gap between them. He looks like he could be in his late 30s, early 40s, and she looks like she hasn't even hit 20 yet. She looks about 18, I'd say. He's just a bit astonished of the answers that she's giving, like they're very mature for her age. And then he goes, come on, talk to me like you're my equal. And then she goes, yet you command me to speak. And he's like, do you consent to speak to me as my equal without, you know, seeming inferior? And then they start having this conversation, and he likes it. He thinks that it's the type of thing that he needs. And then he says to her, I envy you. And she's like, how so? And then he's like, I envy your innocence. And then he goes, when I was your age, fate dealt me a blow. And that, guys, is a little teaser of a story yet to come. That's the only way I can put it. Anyway, she doesn't really know what that means, but she doesn't let it go. And then they start talking, and the conversation's getting deeper and deeper. And then she comes to a point and she says, I'm sorry, I fear the conversation has gotten out of my depth. And he's like, oh, I get it. You're afraid of me. And she's like, no, sir. I just simply don't wish to speak nonsense. Oh my god. And he just looks at her and smiles, and oh my god, that is their first encounter. Can you imagine how intense every other encounter is? Right guys, from here on out it gets very interesting. So that night, after they have that conversation, everybody goes to bed, but throughout the night Jane can always hear weird noises and screams coming from the house, and she can't really figure out where they're coming from. But she wakes up one night because she can hear this noise, and not only that, she can smell something as well. So she gets out of bed, sticks on her candle because there's no electricity in those days, gets a candle, comes out of her room, and her room's not too far away from Mr. Rochester's, and she can smell burning, and she opens up a bedroom door, and it's his bedroom, and the bedroom is on fire. and she runs to the bed and she tries to go and wake him up, and he's not waking up, and she's like, sir, sir, and then he's not waking up, so she's like, oh my god. So she runs, tries to get a bowl of water and throw the water on the fire, and at that point Mr. Rochester decided to wake up, thank god, and he realizes what's happening. There's fire all around his bed, so he jumps out of bed, and guys, he's only got like a nightie on, nothing else, and he gets the curtains and he drags it down and he puts the fire out with her, and then it's just black and dark and smoky, and she can see that he's not got much on, so she turns around whilst he puts some trousers on. But guys, she does have a cheeky look. She does a quick whoosh, like that. She says, I heard a noise and I came in here and your bedroom was on fire. And he says to her, right, you stay here, do not move, do not make a sound. And then before he leaves the room to go and check out what the hell's just happened, he puts his jacket on top of her because she's really cold and she's only in her nightie. And so she sits in his chair and waits for him because that's what he told her to do. And then when she wakes up, she just sees him staring at her. And he's probably been standing there for a while, we don't know. She wakes up and she's like, what's happened? And he looks at her and he says, you are to say nothing about this. And she's like, but you almost just died. And he's like, no, I will take account of the events that happened here tonight. You mustn't say anything. And she's like, all right then. So she gives him the coat and she goes to walk past him, and then he stops her and he goes, is that how you'll leave me then? And she looks at him and he's like, Jane, fire is a horrible death. You just saved my life. Don't walk past me like we're strangers. And she's like, what am I to do then? And then he throws the coat on the bed and he gives her his hand. And then she hesitantly, she takes the time, but not too much time. She goes and puts her hand in his, and he takes it and he says, I have the pleasure in owing you my life. And then she says, there is no debt. And guys, they're getting like closer and closer to each other at this point. He looks at her and he says, I knew you would do me good in some way. I saw it in your eyes the first time I beheld you. And she is just like getting sucked in by this, and then she manages to stop herself, and then she's like, good night, sir. And he goes, you will leave me? And then she says, I am cold. And then he says, go. She goes back to bed, but I don't think that she slept that night, guys. I really don't. She wakes up the next morning, and Mr. Rochester is gone. And the thing about Mr. Rochester is, when he leaves Thornfield, you do not know when he is coming back. It could be days, weeks, months, years even. So she comes down in the morning expecting to see him, and it's kind of exciting now that there's another guy, there's another person in the house. But not only is it a person, it's this man that, she wants to know more about, but he's gone and left her without saying goodbye. So she thinks that, there's nothing more to their relationship. Maybe it's just in her head, but it's always really intense when they're around each other. So she just goes about her day. She gets on with her job. She tutors Adele, and a couple of weeks go by, and next thing you know, they get word that Mr. Rochester's coming back home. And not only is he coming home, but he has invited a big group of guests to come and accompany him at his house at Thornfield. And one of those guests is Miss Ingram, who talk of the town say that she likes Mr. Rochester and vice versa, and that they will eventually, inevitably, get married very soon. So she's coming, and Miss Fairfax tells Jane this bit of gossip, because Miss Fairfax, to be fair, is a bit of a gossip, and that's all she's got going for her in her life, really. And so she just, tells Jane all this like gossip, like, yeah, Miss Ingram and Mr. Rochester, oh, they've been seeing each other for ages, they really like each other, it won't be long now before they get married, all this malarkey. And Jane's just like sat there going, oh, okay. So everyone's like running around the house getting it prepared, because obviously guests are coming now. And Jane is just kind of going about her day, just tutoring Adele, thinking nothing much of it really, just thinking once she finishes for the day she'll just go back to her room and read or something. And as the guests and Mr. Rochester enter Thornfield, Miss Fairfax runs to go and get Jane, and she says to Jane, you better put on a pretty dress tonight because Mr. Rochester wants you down in the ballroom with everybody. And she's like, me? And she's like, yeah, you. And then she's like, no, I can't. I don't have a pretty dress. I can't come downstairs. I'm just going to stay in my quarters. And Miss Fairfax says, I should let you know that if you don't come of your own free will, Mr. Rochester says that he will come and get you himself. And she's just looking at her like, what? So she thinks to herself, okay, he must want me there, okay. He might want to show off his new governess to everybody. So she gets changed in her best attire. It's not compared to what everyone else is wearing. It is still very plain Jane, but you know, it's the best she has. So anyway, she goes down into the ballroom. She doesn't say hello to Mr. Rochester because he's really engaged with everyone else, but she does sit there. And then she sees, out of the whole crowd, she instantly spots Miss Ingram because she is the most beautiful woman in that room. And she watches how her and Mr. Rochester are talking to each other and laughing and singing. And Miss Ingram starts to play the piano and sing. And Jane is just sat there. She's like, right, I've had enough of this. I've got a headache. This lady's giving me a headache. I'm going to bed. So she tries to sneak out of the room as everybody's watching Miss Ingram entertain everybody. And who notices her? Mr. Rochester sees that she has left. He notices it straight away, and she doesn't even make it to the stairs, guys. On her way to the stairs, he's followed her and he's like, why did you leave the room? And she was like, sorry, I was getting tired. And he was like, you haven't seen me in weeks. It would have been nice for you to come up to me and say hello. And she was like, well, you seemed engaged. It's really intense, these conversations, man. And he looks at her and he says, you look unwell. And she goes, no, I am well. And he goes, you look depressed. No word of a lie, that's what he says. He says, you look depressed. In walks Miss Fairfax and he gets annoyed because she's interrupted them. And she says, sorry to interrupt you, but there's somebody at the door for you, a man. And he's like, oh, God. And then she says, I'm Mr. Richard Mason. And he kind of shoots up a bit and he's like, what? She's like, I've left him in the morning room. And he's like, it's alright, just bring him to my study. And then when she leaves the room, he starts to like panic a bit. And Jane can see this happening. And she's like, are you alright, sir? And he starts talking weird and he starts saying things like, if everybody in that room decided to up and leave me and look at me in disgust, would you do the same? And she was like, no, sir, I would stay with you. And he was like, you would dare condemnation for me? And she goes, I would for any friend that was deserving of it. And he just looks at her and he just knows that he can trust her. This man walks in, this Richard Mason, and they kind of embrace, so you can tell that they're old friends, old acquaintances, but whatever they are, we know that they know each other and that something is going on. And then later that night, everybody's in bed and they hear a massive scream. So Jane, like everyone else, runs out into the hallway because all the guests have stayed the night as well. And Mr. Rochester is come out and he's tried to calm everyone down. And he goes, sorry guys, it was just one of the maids. They had a nightmare, it's fine, it's sorted, go back to your chambers. And then he looks at Jane and kind of makes a suggestion like, no, you don't go back to bed, you stay here. So everybody goes back to bed and he takes her and he makes her follow him into this room. She goes into this room and she sees Richard Mason there, the guy from earlier on, but he's not really moving. And she goes closer and she can see that his arm is all covered in blood and like he's been viciously attacked. So Mr. Rochester says to her, listen, what I want you to do is tend to the wound, just keep putting water on it. If he bleeds out, put pressure on it, but you are under no circumstances obliged to speak to him. And then he says the same thing to Mason. So Mr. Rochester goes off to get a doctor, that's why he's left her in the room with him, and he's gone for about an hour or two, and she or him, Richard or Jane, don't speak to each other at all. They follow the rules. She's just tending to his wound, but she can still hear these noises going on from the other side of the wall. And then she tries to get closer to the wall, but by that time Mr. Rochester has come back into the room and he's gotten a doctor, and he wants to get Richard Mason out of the house as fast as he can before any of his guests wake up and start questioning what happened. So they do that, they get him out of the house, and it's just starting to dawn at this point, and she goes outside with him to send this guy off to the doctors, and she's just stood there in her nightie with her hair out, and then they start having a conversation, and she obviously queries him as to what the hell just happened. He basically says to her that, I'm so sorry, I can't tell you, but you, look at the night you've had, and you showed no fear. And she was like, well, I was bloody afraid of that room next door. And he's like, trust me, you were in no danger, I assure you. And then she tries to ask, well, can you explain a little as to what the hell just happened? And then he tries to explain a little and says to her, look, I carry with me through life a really dark burden that haunts me and will haunt me forever probably. And then he goes on to say to her that, listen, I came home this spring, soul withered, depressed, heartbroken, just really down, in a really dark place. And I met this gentle stranger who has revived, whose society revives me. That's what he says, whose society revives me. And I think of her as my lovely one, and with knowing that she's within my house, I think that I can live again. Tell me, do you think I am punching above my weight here? And she is thinking, well, who the hell is this he's going on about, and just assumes that it's Miss Ingram. And she goes, well, no, if the woman is of noble stock, and reciprocates the notion. And he looks at her and he's thinking, who the hell are you talking about? And then she's like, Miss Ingram, of course. And he's like, bloody Nora Jane, I'm talking about you, you loser. He doesn't say it quite like that. He just looks at her and says, I'm asking, what would Jane Eyre do to secure my happiness? And she says, anything, sir, anything that was right. And he just looks at her and he puts a flower in her hair, and they do that thing again when they get really, really close to each other but nothing happens. They just intensely stare at each other. She then gets a letter sent to her on this particular day, and she goes to get Mr. Rochester because she needs to let him know what's in this letter. And he's playing around with Miss Ingram, and she's like, oh god, do I disturb this, do I not disturb this? Anyway, she disturbs them, and she says, Mr. Rochester, I need to speak with you. Mr. Rochester can't run to her fast enough, and he's like, okay. And she just makes him really happy. And so they go into his study, and she explains to him that her cousin, John Reed, remember that horrible boy that used to bully her and beat her up? Her cousin, he's died. His mother, her Aunt Reed of Gateshead, has become really ill with the news of her son's death, and she has asked for me to come and see her. And he looks at her and he's like, what, the same Mrs. Reed of Gateshead that cast you out? And Jane Eyre's just like, yeah, she's asked for me, so I need to go and take some leave and you know, go to her, see what she wants. And he's looking at her like, well, I don't want you to leave. She's like, sir, you haven't paid me, I haven't got my wages. And he goes, oh, sorry, how much do I owe you? And she's like, £30. And then he goes to this little chest and pulls out these massive papers which were meant to be money back in the day. And he goes, here's 50. And she goes, that's too much, sir. And then he's like, well, that's all I've got. All I've got is a 10 other than this. And then she takes the £10 and then she says to him, now you owe me. And then they have another little moment, as they always do. And he just says to her, make sure you come back to me. And so off she trots to Gateshead to go and see this aunt to see what she wants. And I know, guys, you're probably thinking we don't really care what happens when she goes back to Gateshead. We just want to know what happens with her and Mr. Rochester. I know, but I have to quickly let you in on what happens because it is critical to the story. So she goes back to Gateshead, not much has changed, and her aunt is obviously ill. She's lying down in bed, looks like she's about to die. And her aunt says to her, I was really bad to you, as you know, when you were a child, and And Jane's just sat there going, yes, yes you were. And she was like, it was because of the way you looked at me, you hated me. And then Jane just looks at her and says, I would have loved you if you let me. And it's really sad actually, but that's not the reason why the aunt wants her there. Basically, the aunt's on her last legs and she's brought Jane over to tell her, look, you have another uncle. You think that you have no other family members, but an uncle has declared you his niece, and he wrote to you a couple of years ago, and he wrote the letter to this address. You obviously didn't live here, and I never sent it to you or to the school, so I've kept this information from you. And she takes this letter. In the letter, it's this letter from this uncle, this anonymous uncle that she doesn't know, and he says, look, I've come into some money and I've got no children and you're my niece and I want you to come and live with me. But because this letter hasn't been answered for years, obviously we can assume that the uncle thinks something's happened to her. Oh, no we don't. He doesn't assume, because the aunt has already wrote back to him saying that she's dead. Evil, isn't she? What an evil cow. Anyway, Jane doesn't make any face expressions. She doesn't say anything. She just takes the letter, she reads it, she looks at her aunt and she says, I forgive you, be at peace. And she goes and she gets out of there, and then she writes back to her uncle saying that I'm very much alive. I very much would love to meet you if, you know, you're in the neighbourhood. I'm joking. Wherever you are, I want to know you. You're my only family member. The only family member I have in my life. Of course I want to meet you. And then she goes back home to Thornfield, and who's waiting for her? Mr. Rochester. So as she's walking up, he's looking out into the distance because he's in the gardens, and he can see that she's returned, and he's got the biggest smile on his face. So she's settling back down into her routine, and she sees Miss Fairfax after a couple of weeks, and Miss Fairfax informs her that Mr. Rochester, whilst you've been away, has been making preparations for a wedding. And Jane's like, whose wedding? She's like, well, his wedding, of course, to Miss Ingram. So Jane thinks, oh my god, whilst I've been away, he's been making preparations to get married to this other woman. What am I going to do? Where does that leave me? I can't obviously teach Adele anymore. She'll probably go off to school because she's getting better at English. So I'm no longer needed at this house. So understandably, Jane is not in the best mood right now. She's like, oh my god, what kind of man is this? So she goes, and she's just on the rampage at the moment, but she doesn't let him see that. But internally, it's internal, you can see it, she's really angry, she's really upset, and she goes to find Mr. Rochester, and he's outside in the gardens, and she goes, I heard you are to be married. And then he just looks at her and he goes, yes, I've been making preparations. He doesn't deny it. He goes, yeah, I am preparing to get married. And then she said, well, Adele will need to go to school, and there'll no longer be any need for me, so I'll try and find a new placement as soon as I can. And then she walks off, and then she turns back around and she goes, congratulations. And then just walks off into the gardens, probably to have a good old cry. That is what any of us would do, I think. And he's looking at her thinking, oh my god, what is wrong with this girl? And he runs after her and chases her, and oh my god, guys, this is it. This is the scene. This is the scene of all scenes. This is it. This is not just the scene of all scenes. This is the chapter of all chapters in the book. Oh my god, if you read this, right, even if you don't want to read the book, just skip to 292, page 292, and read this paragraph. Oh my god, it makes me want to do this. So good. So, are we ready for it? So guys, Mr. Rochester, it's safe to say he's got scared now that Jane's gonna leave him, and he's so, like, he's panicking a bit because she's completely misunderstood everything. And so he chases after her and he goes, me and you, we've been good friends, haven't we? And she's like, yeah. And then he explains to her in the film, he says to her, look, it feels like I have this thread tied around my rib, and it's connected to something inside of you, and if you were to leave, I'm afraid that cord of connection would be broken and I would take to bleed inwardly, but you would forget about me. Because God, he's so smart, that Mr. Rochester. He wants to see where her mind's at and see, you know, would you forget about me? And she gets so angry and she turns around and she goes, how could I forget about you? And then this is the speech, guys, that she says. Now, she does say it in the film, but they obviously have to cut bits out of it. But I will tell you what it says in the book because it's incredible. So she turns around and she says, well, in her body language, she's looking at him and she's thinking, how dare you think that? And then she says, I love Thornfield. I grieve to leave Thornfield because I have lived in it a full and delightful life, momentarily at least. I have not been trampled on. I have not been petrified. I have not been buried with inferior minds or excluded from every glimpse of communion with what is bright and energetic and high. I've talked face to face with what I reverence, with what I delight in, with an original and vigorous and expanded mind. I have known you, Mr. Rochester, and it strikes me with terror and anguish to feel I must be torn from you forever. So I see the necessity of departure, and it is like looking on the necessity of death. And then he's like, where do you see the necessity? And she's like, you've placed it before me. And he's like, in what shape? And she's like, in the shape of Miss Ingram, a noble and beautiful woman, your bride. And he's like, my bride? I have no bride. What bride? And she's like, yeah, but you will have. And he's like, yes, I will. And she's like, well, then you have said it yourself, I must leave. And then he's like, no, Jane, you must stay. I know I've adopted a bit of a northern accent here. She goes, do you think I can stay here to become nothing to you? What, do you think I'm an automaton, a machine without feelings, and can bear to have my morsel of bread snatched from my lips, or my drop of living water dashed from my cup? Do you think, because I am poor, obscure, plain and little, that I am soulless and heartless? You think wrong. I have as much soul as you and full as much heart, and if God had blessed me with much wealth and beauty, I would have made it as hard for you to leave me as it is now for me to leave you. I'm not talking to you now through the medium of custom or conventionalities, nor of mortal flesh. It is my spirit that addresses yours, as if we had passed through the grave together and stood at God's feet, equal as we are. And then he shakes her and he's like, as we are. And he's like, it's you, you weird unearthly thing. It's you, you're the one I want. And she's like, you're marrying Miss Ingram. And he's like, no, I'm not. She's the machine without feelings. And then he explains to her, he says to her, look, I don't like Miss Ingram at all. I know all she wants me for is my wealth. So I tested it and I put a little white lie out there. I told a bit of gossip to people that I wasn't really worth how much everyone thought I was. And the news got back to Miss Ingram and her mother. And the whole reason I invited them here to stay is so I could see what they were like towards me. And it was nothing but coldness and the brush off, proving that she just wanted me for my money. But you, I'm in love with you. I've always wanted you. It's always ever been you. And she's still like, what, are you mocking me? Is this some kind of sick joke, buddy? You don't want me. And he's like, what else do I have to do to explain that I want you? And then she's like, oh my God, maybe this is true. Maybe he does want me. And then it starts to kick in like, oh my God, he does love me. And then he goes, please say you'll marry me. And she says, yes. It's just amazing. Oh my God, it's like rewatching it all over again. So they decide to get married and he's done all the preparations, but he's done it rapidly. She's not planned anything, he's planned everything. He wants to be married to her now, here, today. And she's thinking, what is the rush? But she just gets on with it. She just thinks, oh, he loves me that much. Well, really, there is some reasons in the background that she doesn't know of yet. Anyway, it comes to the wedding day and she gets dressed, and she's all dressed up. It's the loveliest she's ever looked, and she goes to see him, and he's really agitated, really in a rush, not thinking about anything, not taking anything in. He grabs her and he walks her all the way to the church. They don't say a word there, but he's just really grabbing her and taking her to the church. And then there's no one there to watch them get married. It's just the vicar, and I don't know if anyone else is there, but it's just the vicar, I think. And he's really rushing things. Like, Mr. Rochester is really rushing everything. And the vicar starts talking, starts getting them married, and then that bit where it says, is anyone here today who doesn't feel like these two should be married? Speak now, forever hold your peace. In walks this lawyer. This man, we don't know it's a lawyer, but at the time it's just a man, and he's got a piece of paper in his hand, and he stops the wedding and he goes, this wedding must be stopped. And Mr. Rochester's like, no, forget him, just carry on with the wedding, carry on. And the vicar's really confused, and he's like, why, do you know any reason why these two shouldn't be married? And the lawyer's like, yes, I do. Because Mr. Rochester, and he's got the paper in his hand, he can't marry her because Mr. Rochester is already married. And then in walks behind him Richard Mason. And Richard Mason, remember that guy who got stabbed in the night? He is Mr. Rochester's wife's brother. So that's his brother-in-law. And Jane's just like watching this, like, what? He's married? And the man's like, yes, Mr. Rochester's already married to a Bertha Antoinetta Mason. And then, oh my god, Mr. Rochester, he's absolutely vexed. He's so angry, and he tries to go and beat up Richard Mason for ruining everything because he was this close to getting his happiness. And then he says to everybody, don't blame Jane, she had nothing to do with this, she knew nothing. And then she takes Jane and she goes, come on, and then he goes, come on everybody, let's go meet my wife. He marches her back to the house. Everybody thinks that they're married, so they start throwing confetti, and he just goes, everybody go away. And they go into the attic, and there's this woman there, and oh my god, she looks horrific. She just looks like a mental person. Her hair's everywhere, she's really weird, she's really ill, she looks really ill. Jane's like, oh my god, this is it, this is where the noises have been coming from. This woman has been making noises and sounds, and everything strange that happens in this house happens because of her. And Jane just runs to her bedroom and rips the wedding dress off as fast as she can, literally just tries to, and it's a corset, because it was a corset back in those days, so she's literally ripping everything out, trying to get out of the dress, and then she just locks herself in the room and does not come out for hours. And at this point, everybody has now gone home, everybody knows the truth. Mr. Rochester, he's called Edward, he's waiting outside her room just to make sure she's okay. He doesn't go in, he doesn't knock, he wants to give her space. And then she finally comes out of her bedroom. She comes out of her room, and he sat there waiting for her, and he's like, Jane, you're not crying? Why aren't you upset? Why aren't you shouting at me? I deserve it. It would be the least I deserved. And then she just walks off, and she feels a bit faint, and he can see that she's struggling to stand. So he picks her up and he takes her into the living room, and puts her in his chair next to the fire, gives her some wine to drink, and says, look, are you okay? And she's like, I'll be fine in a minute. And then he goes to kiss her, and she just gives him the brush off. And then he knows that he's done really wrong, and that he has to explain to her exactly what's happened. And then he says to her, look, Bertha Antoinetta Mason was arranged, it was an arranged marriage, and it was arranged for me by my father when I was a young boy, when I was only your age. I didn't have a say in it. The only reason I got married to her was because of her father's fortune of like £30,000, which would go to him because he would be her husband if anything happened. So it was basically an inheritance job. That's the only reason he got married. There was no love involved, there was nothing. And he said, listen, she was a nutter quite frankly, she was horrible and, you know, really violent, and only cruelty would check her, and I'd not use cruelty. That's what he says. And then she says, Jane just says, oh my god, I pity you, I'm so sorry. He's like looking at her and he's like, Jane, have you ever entered a madhouse? And Jane's looking around like, no, I haven't. And he's like, it's the worst thing you will ever see in your life. They treat everybody like beasts. I spared her that at least, so I kept her in my attic all these years. And then he says, please marry me. And she goes, I cannot marry you, you are married. And he goes, who would you offend by living with me? Who would care? And she's like, I would care. And he goes, what, so you drive me to insanity over a mere human law? And she goes, look, I have to respect myself. You're a married man. And he goes, look, I pledge you my loyalty, my honour, my love till death do us part. And she's like, you cannot. And he's like, well, I can, and I do. And then they have this weird, they have one of their moments again, but this time it's a bit of a weird moment where he's trying to hold her and she's trying to like let go of him, but she can't because she's so in love with him. And he's just like grabbing her, holding her, and he's saying to her, look, I could bend you with my finger and my thumb. That's literally what he says, meaning like I could force you to live with me, you know, and have you physically or to myself, but why won't you just come of your own free will? You know, I keep banging at this cage, but it's your soul that I want, and you're not giving it to me. And it's the hardest thing for her to let go, but she pushes him up. Listen, man, he's saying all the right things. Did you just hear everything I said? That's what he said. And all I can say is Jane is a very, very strong woman to leave him, because if that was me, okay, I would leave, but it'd take me a bit longer. I wouldn't go straight away. If he kept saying all those things to me, I'd be like, oh, no, but I would do he'd make me think about it. You know, he's saying all the right things, and bless him, it's not really his fault, but he just went about it the wrong way. For God's sake, Edward. What an idiot. Anyway, she leaves. She goes back into her room, and he just thinks that she's in her room, and she's been there for ages now, and he's getting a bit worried, so he starts to bang on her door, manages to break the door, sees that the window's open, bed sheets, the classic bed sheets are out of it, and she's gone, she's done a runner, and he's like, Jane, like screaming after her. And that, my friends, is the beginning of the end. That is the beginning scene when she's running away. That is who she's running away from. She's running away from Mr. Rochester. And that is how she ends up in that house. She's been living at this other house for a while now. She's given them a fake last name. I think she's given her real name, but her fake last name. The guy who took her in and saved her, he's called St. John. I think his last name's called Rivers. And it was his two sisters that live in the house as well. And they've kind of taken her in as another sister, and that's all Jane wants to be seen as. She would love it to be seen as a sister by all of them. And this guy, St. John, helps Jane get work as a teacher, but the pay's rubbish, but she'll have her own accommodation, and you know, she'll be teaching girls, and she's so happy with that, and she cannot be more grateful. And he helps her move in, he helps her with absolutely everything, and of course, spending so much time with her, he starts to get feelings for her. And so by the end, he asks her to marry him, and she goes, please, I don't want to marry you, we're meant to be like brother and sister. And he's like, well, I don't see you as a sister, I see you as something more, and I want to marry you. There's no reason for you not to want to marry me. She goes, if I were to marry you, it would kill me. And then he looks at her and he's like, that is very unfeminine and very untrue. At this point, she is yearning for Mr. Rochester. She hears him every night. He calls her name. It's very harrowing. It is a bit Heathcliff Cathy vibes, I'm not gonna lie. Charlotte might have, one day when Emily wasn't at the table, she might have just peeked over, looked at her writing. But she hears Mr. Rochester every day. She thinks about him every day. She dreams about him every day. When she's alone in her house and there's no light, there's only a little fire burning, she imagines him finding her and knocking on the door. And she's not even mad at him anymore. She just wants to embrace him, but she knows that it's been too long. Too much time has passed. But at this point, once St. John says, look, I want to marry you, she's hearing Mr. Rochester more and more and more, and she knows in her heart that something's wrong, something's happened. So she says, look, I need to go, and she goes back to Thornfield. Before she does that, and before St. John says he wants to marry her, he comes to her house because he's received a letter, and the letter is from her uncle that she wrote to. Remember the uncle that her only living relative? Her uncle's passed away, but has left a large sum of money to Jane. So Jane is now a rich woman. So knowing this information, she doesn't really care about it at this stage. She just wants to go and see Mr. Rochester because she keeps hearing his voice, that he's calling her. So she goes back to Thornfield, and as she's approaching Thornfield, she can see that it's all burnt down. She's like, oh my god, something terrible has happened. You know, thinking the worst, he might have died. She goes to Thornfield and she looks, and it's just a bunch of ruins. This beautiful castle, it's just a bunch of ruins. And she finds Miss Fairfax. Miss Fairfax explains that it was Mr. Rochester's wife. She set the house on fire and she tried to kill herself, and I think she does. He tried to save her, but she ended up killing herself, and in trying to save her, as a consequence, he's lost his eyesight, so he's blind now. And she's like, where is he? And he's outside in the gardens by the tree where he proposed to her. And she looks at him and his hair's all over the place, his beard's grown out, he can't see, he's got a walking stick. And she goes over to him and she touches his hand, and he's like, this hand, I recognise this hand. And then she gets his hand, puts it on her face, and then he just instantly knows it's Jane Eyre. He's like, Jane, you've come back to me. And then he's like, oh my god, am I dreaming? And then she kisses him, and then she says, awaken then. And they just embrace and they have this big hug. So emotional. Lost my voice after all that. And then it just ends. What a story, right? Oh my god, my mum's back from work. How long have I been sat here? So yes guys, that is the story of Jane Eyre. Of course I've left bits out, but guys, if I hadn't, we would literally be here all night. I really recommend watching it. Watch the 2011 version of Jane Eyre. You're gonna absolutely love it. And then, if you fancy it, give the book a read. Oh my god, I enjoyed telling you that so much. Please watch it. Please let me know if you've watched it and if you've enjoyed it. I would love to know. But I am gonna go and have a lie down after that. That was just a lot of emotions. You know, playing all those characters it's really taking it out of me. Please give it a like if you like this video. Please give it a thumbs up, and please subscribe for more, because there definitely will be dramatic readings and all. I got so dramatic during that scene. Yes, take care guys, stay safe, stay healthy, and I will see you in the next video. Mwah.